When Zola landed and told his story to Commander Huxtable, the squadron leader patted him on the shoulder and commiserated. "Take the day off tomorrow. I'll put someone else on the morning combat air patrol. Relax and take it easy." That was what Ensign Zola planned to do on October 25th. When Lieutenant Roby returned to the Gambia Bay on October 24th, after his encounter with Japanese planes over Leyte, he performed 2 barrel rolls across the deck at 100 feet before landing. This maneuver was a signal that he had shot down 2 enemy planes. Roby was surrounded by a band of officers and men congratulating him on his victories. It was satisfying to the men of the Gambia Bay to be recognized for their accomplishments. The failure of Lieutenant Darren's torpedo bomber brought a moment of concern, as did Huxtable's. But Huxtable was down safely, and Darren was expected to be recovered the next day from the Herman. There was no tragedy at the moment to cause concern among the shipmates. They were alert but unworried and unafraid. The greatest tension was on the bridge, where Captain Vegg knew that something important was brewing. All afternoon, messages from the flagship and intercepts from various commands indicated that the Japanese were moving a number of ships into Philippine waters. The messages were incomplete and conflicting. 3 different forces were identified, and many of the Gambia Bay officers wondered about the accuracy of the reports. Nonetheless, it was clear that October 25th promised to be a busy day with plenty of action for the fighters and torpedo bombers. Every aircraft on the flight deck and hangar deck was checked over. Those sent up to the flight deck were fueled and armed with general-purpose bombs for use against troops and military installations on the ground. During dinner in the wardroom, the talk focused on the day's action, the unexpected appearance of so many Japanese bombers over Leyte, and the long but negative search conducted by Commander Huxtable's planes that afternoon. At 8 p.m. on October 24th, Captain Vegg called a conference in the Combat Information Centre. Commander Ballinger, Commander Boris, Lieutenant Commander Waring, and Lieutenants Elliot, Budus, and Odom were present. The captain discussed the ship's readiness to continue its assigned mission of supporting the troops. Captain Vegg spoke about the increasing number of Japanese aircraft observed that day and warned to expect more planes on the 25th. Some of those planes would likely be sent to attack the carriers, particularly given the known Japanese attitude that carriers were primary targets. Captain Vegg then asked each senior officer for their assessment of the situation. All agreed that on the 25th they must expect maximum air effort from the enemy and that the ship must be prepared for any eventuality. Vegg closed the meeting with a warning. "Well, any way you look at it, we are in for a fight tomorrow and will be lucky to escape heavy damage." Lieutenant Odom and the other junior officers were dismissed. Odom went to his cabin, wrote a letter to his wife, and got into his bunk to sleep before the early morning call to general quarters. He drifted off with the captain's words in mind, thinking, "Let the Japanese planes come. We'll shoot them down one at a time or in bunches, as we have before." Chaplain Carlson received a call from the captain that evening. He had been giving evening prayers over the public address system before taps. The captain asked the chaplain not to pray for preservation from danger, but that the crew might have what it took to see them through. The chaplain left the captain with a feeling that something significant was going to happen the next morning. Captain Vegg then called in Commander Huxtable and Lieutenant Cordner, the ordnance officer. They discussed the possibility of action against enemy fleet units. The major question in Captain Vegg's mind was the squadron's readiness for a torpedo attack if necessary. There had been no occasion for torpedo activity since he came aboard, and he was not familiar with the degree of the squadron's readiness. Commander Huxtable assured the captain that the pilots of Composite Squadron 10 were competent. Lieutenant Bell verified that the pilots had been thoroughly briefed in enemy ship identification. These assurances gratified Captain Vegg, and he dismissed the meeting with a reminder to Lieutenant Cordner, Commander Boris, and Commander Huxtable to be prepared to load torpedoes on short notice. As this meeting was taking place aboard the Gambia Bay, Admiral Kurita, with the main Japanese attack force of battleships and cruisers, had turned around in the Sulu Sea after suffering major damage from American air attacks throughout the day. Kurita had already been torpedoed out of his flagship the cruiser Agi, and spent half a day in a destroyer before moving to the battleship Yamato, where he was unhappy due to the loss of half his communication experts with the cruiser. Throughout the day, the Yamato had been hit by Americans, and her sister ship, the Mushi, one of the most powerful vessels in the world, had been hit by 19 aerial torpedoes and 17 bombs. Kurita passed the Mushi as she fell behind, reversed course, and decided to give up the attack. He passed her again as she struggled to stay afloat, but with a direct order from Tokyo to continue, Kurita and his battleships and cruisers moved toward Leyte. They would soon thread the narrow passage at the end of the Sulu Sea, called the San Bernardino Strait, and approach the Americans from the north. As Captain Veg discussed the possibility that the Gambier Bay's torpedo bombers might need to strike capital ships the next day, those capital ships were bearing down on him in the darkness. When the actual word of warning about Japanese warships came to Captain Veg late that night, the message did not refer to Kurita's force, but to Nishimura's force, which consisted of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers that had moved into the Suruga Strait after Commander Huxtable and his torpedo bomber scouts had missed them the day before. Nishimura planned to reach a point off the entrance to Leyte Gulf at 4 o'clock on the morning of October 25th. Admiral Shima's force, several hours behind, was also on its way. At 11:30 p.m. on October 24th, American PT boats in the Suruga Strait spotted the advanced elements of Nishimura's force and attacked. The Japanese destroyer Shigura began firing on the PT boats, revealing the enemy's presence. By midnight, Admiral Oldendorf had received the message and was lying in wait for the Japanese. At 2:30 a.m., Captain Veg was awakened by the communications watch officer with the news that the Battle of Suruga Strait had begun. Sleepily, Captain Veg took the message and then snapped awake. His next command was to order the torpedo bombers of the Gambier Bay to be loaded. The morning flight was already loaded with bombs, but he ordered that the rest be loaded with torpedoes. The planned missions would be flown, but the Gambier Bay would also be prepared to strike the enemy's big ships. Initially, Composite Squadron 10 was obligated to send 6 torpedo bombers on other chores, but the last 4 would be ready. 2 planes were immediately loaded with torpedoes, and 2 more torpedoes were placed in a ready condition on the hangar deck and could be loaded quickly. On the flight deck and in the hangar there was trouble. One of the air-spotting planes for the morning's operations was brought to the bow elevator in a tow tractor, but was left without setting the brake. At that moment, the ship hit a heavy swell, and the tractor dropped down the elevator. The elevator was at the bottom of the shaft, where a fighter plane had just been loaded for transport to the flight deck. The tow tractor hit hard enough to damage the engine of the FM-2, and the fighter had to be taken back into the hangar for an engine change. Some crew members sleeping near the hangar deck heard the crash and thought the ship had been torpedoed. It took half an hour to settle them down. Then came word that the remaining torpedo planes were to be loaded with torpedoes. This message caused Chief Ordnance Man Andy Andrews to wake up Chief Montgomery, who was sleeping nearby. The planes would have to be defueled, brought down to the hangar deck, loaded with torpedoes, and then brought up again and fueled. It was going to take some time. At 4:30 a.m. came the call to General Quarters. The pilots of the fighters selected for the combat air patrol prepared their planes. Lieutenant Odom and the other ship's officers donned sidearms, knives, and life belts, and hurried to their action stations. Before dawn, the fighters were launched, and the ship secured from General Quarters. Lieutenant Odom went into his office to check the weather. The sea was calm, with a long rolling swell. There was virtually no wind, and the current was moving west. He reported to the bridge and then went to the wardroom for breakfast. He returned in 15 minutes so Lieutenant Commander Waring could go to eat. His battle station was air plot, and when the Gambier Bay planes were in the air, they maintained a constant watch. Lieutenant Budus also returned to the Combat Information Center to monitor the situation. They kept an eye on the big plexiglass board where the Combat Information Center plotted the results of the radar search. When the ship was secured, the enlisted men headed for the mess deck. The line was always long in the mornings, and aviation machinist's mate third-class PNC did not feel like facing it. He decided to take a nap in the oxygen shop. While lying down in the storage section, he experienced a peculiar sensation, feeling as though he was in two worlds simultaneously. He saw the image of his dead grandmother, who spoke to him in Ukrainian, saying, "Don't stay here." Before PNC's eyes, the oxygen shop seemed to explode, and the corrugated bulkhead separating his shop from the firefighters next door blew up in a shower of metal. Shaken, he got up, left the shop, and went topside. Usually careless about obeying the order to keep his life jacket on during general quarters, he made sure he had all his equipment laid out. Shortly after midnight, Admiral Kurita's ships were safely through the narrow San Bernardino Strait. Throughout the passage, Kurita braced himself for an American ambush at the narrow bottleneck, as was happening to Admiral Nishimura at the Suruga Strait. But Kurita saw nothing. There was no guard on the San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Kincaid had assumed Admiral Holly was guarding the strait, but Holly had discovered the whereabouts of a fourth Japanese force, the Carriers. As Admiral Toyota in Tokyo had confidently predicted, Holly was eager to destroy the Carriers. Holly might not have been so eager had he known that the Japanese carriers had been stripped of nearly all their planes and were scarcely more dangerous than transport ships at that moment. This Pacific War had turned into a carrier war, and Admiral Nimitz agreed that Holly was to go after the carriers if the chance arose. The Japanese strategy of decoying Holly was brilliant, but ultimately futile given the forces available to the Japanese. Admiral Kurita knew that his one chance for limited success, destroying before being destroyed, was to surprise the Americans at dawn. Shortly after debouching the strait, he formed his force on a broad front and then turned south down the coast of Samar. An hour before sunrise, the Japanese ships assumed a circular pattern in defense against enemy aircraft. Their intelligence indicated a number of fleet carriers were located off Leyte, and they expected to face Holly's power. Kurita had very little information about the enemy, and what he had was faulty. Shortly after the Kurita force came through the San Bernardino Strait, he received a message from Admiral Nishimura saying he was then entering Suruga Strait and there was nothing in sight except a handful of torpedo boats. An hour later, Kurita heard that Nishimura had sighted 3 American ships. What sort of ships Nishimura had not specified. At that point, as Kurita turned south and committed himself, he received word from Admiral Shima travelling to Suruga Strait behind Nishimura. The Nishimura force had been destroyed, and the battleship Yamashiro had exploded, and took Admiral Nishimura with it. The battleship Fuso had broken in half, and the cruiser Mogami had been severely hit, turning about and colliding with Admiral Shima's flagship, the Nachi, before sinking. The attack from the MTH had been a total failure, and the remaining destroyers were scrambling for safety. Admiral Kurita continued southward, expecting to encounter the American ships at Leyte just after sunrise. By 6:30 a.m., Admiral Sprague signalled that the ships of Taffy 3 could secure from general quarters if they wished, and go to Condition 3, which meant only the ordinary watches would be manned. Captain Vegg passed the order and remained on his bridge with Lieutenant Commander Gorn, who was working up his morning position. Lieutenant Stewart and 7 other fighter pilots had been up above Taffy 3 for an hour and a half, and they had nothing unusual to report, as the sun had come up 10 minutes earlier. Visibility was poor due to the rainy season, as noted by Admiral Ugaki in his diary that morning. The weather on the east coast was particularly unfavourable, with scattered dark clouds and squalls making it almost impossible to determine daybreak. At 6:44 a.m., Admiral Ugaki's reverie was interrupted by a lookout aboard the Yamato. On the horizon, 22 miles off to the southwest and bearing north, were masts that seemed to belong to 3 carriers, 3 cruisers, and 2 destroyers. The Gambier Bay, White Plains, and Kitkun Bay were closest to the Japanese, with the Essex, St. Lo, and Kenian Bay nearby, along with the destroyers Hull, Hammond, and Johnston, and the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, Raymond, and John C. Butler. A minute later, on the bridge of the Gambier Bay, Captain Veg heard an intercepted voice transmission from a plane of another force frantically announcing that the Japanese fleet was 40 miles from Taffy, 2 and 10 miles closer to Taffy 3. Moments later, a torpedo bomber on anti-submarine patrol for Taffy 3 reported sighting 4 Japanese battleships, 8 cruisers and 13 destroyers. Radar confirmed the size of the force, which was substantial. The alarm for general quarters began to sound at 6:45 a.m. A minute later, Admiral Sprague's message directed a course change to allow the carriers to launch planes into the wind and make maximum speed. Captain Veg ordered the planes to be launched. Commander Huxtable in the wardroom heard the general alarm and thought to himself, another hop to the Sulu Sea, and no lunch. He decided to stay put for a glass of juice and a piece of toast before heading to the ready room. All other officers scrambled, and within 2 minutes the ship was at general quarters with all stations manned. Commander Huxtable headed for the ready room with Lieutenant John Holland, who urged him to hurry. They saw Lieutenant Vine Bell putting on a flight harness, and Huxtable realized this was an emergency. He grabbed his plotting board and ran for the flight deck. Gunner Charlie Westbrook was sitting down to breakfast when the alarm went off. He woke radioman Lee McDaniel, who had replaced Larry Austin after an accident, and they hurried to the flight deck. Ensign Crocker's plane was the third in line with the engine already running, but McDaniel never showed up. Westbrook persuaded radioman Locke to go with him. His plane was on the hangar deck and would not make it for this emergency. On the bridge, Captain Veg and Commander Boris were preparing to launch. 3 napalm bombs, intended for troop support, were jettisoned over the side. 9 minutes after the call to general quarters, Veg saw the first signs of the enemy, large caliber salvo splashes near the small ships on the northern edge of the formation. 10 fighters and 7 torpedo bombers were ready on deck, although they were not yet loaded with bombs or torpedoes. When general quarters sounded, Chief Montgomery and Chief Horton, the maintenance chief, were on the flight deck testing an engine that had been installed in a fighter hit by the falling tractor the night before. Chief Martin tried to run up the engine, but the fuel pump would not function. As the pilots rushed to their planes, Montgomery and Horton worked on the engine. Lieutenant Zola and Ensign Tetz were in the wardroom when the alarm sounded. Zola had just ordered his eggs when the call came. They ran to the ready room, grabbed their parachute harnesses, and headed for the flight deck. Zola saw all fighters but one with their engines running. He went to the last fighter and started to board, but encountered Lieutenant Joseph Dennis McGraw already in the cockpit. A disappointed Zola stepped back and joined Ensign Tetz and Lieutenant Courtney, who had also missed out. Seaman Quinn was peeling potatoes for the noon meal in the spud locker when general quarters sounded. He left his watch money and belongings behind and went to his 20mm gun, searching the horizon for planes. Fred Deo, the youngest man aboard, was asleep on the flight deck under a plane to escape the heat. When the call came, he rubbed his eyes and ran to his battle station, waiting down below decks. Lieutenant Malgrave was in the after engine room with Chief Engineer Sanders and 17 enlisted men. When the call to general quarters came, the ship was making 127 revolutions per minute. The bridge ordered flank top speed, and in 2 minutes the engines were making 177 revolutions per minute. The bridge asked if all possible speed was being made. Lieutenant Malgrave affirmed, and with enemy ships closing in, permission was requested to light off the smokescreen burners. Permission was granted, and the Gambier Bay began making smoke. The Gambier Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Essex were in the same defensive disposition favoured by the Japanese against air attacks. The 3 carriers were protected by a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. As the Gambier Bay began making smoke, so did all the other ships. Admiral Kurita, pleased for almost the first time since the plan orders at Lingayen, radioed Admiral Toyota, "By heaven-sent opportunity we are dashing to attack the enemy carriers." Kurita had no conception of the vast resources of the American fleet at this point, and he believed the half-dozen carriers he saw before him were Holly's Southern Task Group. If he could destroy them, he would indeed establish a place for himself in the Japanese pantheon, no matter what happened. The Japanese battleships opened fire from 35,000 yards, not quite 20 miles. Geysers began rising around the carriers, with several salvos straddling the White Plains and Fanshawe Bay. The Gambier Bay seemed to be safely unnoticed, and Captain Veg concentrated on launching all his planes. At the helm was Quartermaster Berger Darstom, who had replaced Quartermaster Bell when Bell went into the hospital. Vuegg was on the deck above, talking down through the speaking tube. Aviation machinist's mate. Third-class PNC heard the bugle sound and the bell clang. He went to his shop, donned the bulky KPOK life jacket for the first time in months, strapped on a belt with a 10-inch bayonet his Marine friend Andy Horber had given him, put on 2 canteens, and secured a diamond ring and other valuables. He also picked up a contraband .22 caliber pistol he had acquired from aviation mechanic First Class Kubich. This was one call to General Quarters that PNC took seriously. He left the oxygen shop, went through the light lock and onto the port catwalk. Seaman Heinel had been in the mess hall that morning and had a spoonful of beans poised about 2 inches from his mouth when the bell began to ring. He jumped up and ran to the ship's magazine on the port side of the Gambier Bay, his battle station. He could see the black smoke trailing from their ship and the smoke from the others. When Commander Huxtable reached his plane, he asked aviation machinist's mate, third-class Gutweiler, his plane captain, what kind of load he had. "None," said the plane captain, so Huxtable instructed him to call Commander Boris over the voice tube and ask about a load. Seeing no use in going out without weapons, he watched the bridge and saw Boris move forward, say something to Captain Vuegg, who made a sweeping gesture with his arm as if to say, "Get them off!" Just then, Huxtable heard what sounded like a rifle shot and saw a salvo of heavy caliber shells splashing alongside the Carrier White Plains. Until that moment, he had not realized they were actually in contact with the enemy. There was no time to waste. 3 torpedo bombers were ahead of Huxtable, and he went in turn. As he took off, the lead plane had started its 180 degrees turn for a regular carrier join-up. Huxtable, launched, took the lead and called Admiral Sprague's ship for instructions. The code name was Bendix. An excited voice from Bendix answered, "Attack immediately!" Huxtable headed into the overcast at 1,200 feet to comply. Pisarski was in his stateroom when the alarm bell rang. As a pilot not scheduled for takeoff that morning, he was supposed to go to the ready room more to keep him out of the way than anything else. He walked casually out to the catwalk to see what, if anything, there was to be seen. About this time, Ensign Zola and Ensign Tetz came back down from the flight deck, disappointed at not getting off in the scramble for planes. They looked out across the water and saw the tall black tripod masts characteristic of Japanese battleships. Zola blew out his breath and said, "Christ, look at those pagodas!" When they saw what the ship faced, the 3 pilots on the catwalk rushed to their staterooms, gathered their life preservers, guns, knives, canteens, and other survival gear, and hurried to the ready room. It was empty, but the blackboard had a message from Commander Huxtable. "Bisbee, take charge. Weatherholt, Gallagher, and Pisarski, take off with torpedoes when ready." The 4 extra torpedo bombers were still on the hangar deck, where crews were loading and arming torpedoes. Bisbee arrived, saw the message, and went to the hangar deck. They would have to launch individually as the planes came up in the elevator. Bisbee turned to the others. "Gallagher, you go first. Weatherholt, you team up with him if you can. Pisarski, you go third. Don't wait for me. I'll wait for the last plane." The time was 7:05 a.m., just minutes since the sighting of the enemy had been confirmed, and the Gambier Bay had gone to General Quarters. Lieutenant Bisbee grabbed Pisarski's arm and said, "Give me the combination to your locker. We need a drink around here." Pisarski realized that he was about to take off, and that most of these pilots in the ready room, including Lieutenant Vine Bell, would be stuck riding the ship to whatever destiny it might have. He recited the combination to his liquor locker twice to Bisbee, and then followed Gallagher and Weatherholt up to the flight deck. Bisbee, Vine Bell, John Holland, Joe Phipps, Ernie Courtney, Leo Zola, John Tetz, Joe McCabe, Owen Wheeler, and Tuffy Barrows would not be launched, as there were no planes available. If they needed a drink to conceal their disappointment, they were welcome to it. Bisbee took off for Pisarski's stateroom, and the 3 pilots with planes moved toward the flight deck. They passed the upper first aid station, where Pisarski saw Dr. Wayne Stewart, the flight surgeon, setting up his surgical shop. It reminded him of what he had read about old sailing ships when surgeons prepared their saws and burning irons and strewed sawdust on the deck to soak up the blood. As the pilots reached the flight deck, Gallagher's torpedo bomber came up the elevator with its torpedo in place. Gallagher and his air crewmen leaped aboard. The plane was rolled to the catapult to be yoked for launching. The plane captain ran along behind, yelling and waving his hands, "It's got no gas! It's got to be gassed!" It was 7:08 a.m. As the aircraft hesitated, a voice came over the talk between ships from Bendix, the command ship. "All carriers, launch all aircraft." The captain signalled to launch. Gallagher nodded and waved his hand. He knew by that time that he had only 45 gallons of gas in the torpedo bomber, perhaps enough to keep him flying for 5 minutes after takeoff. He also had a 1-ton torpedo that needed to be delivered as soon as the torpedo bomber was airborne. Gallagher turned left and headed for the first big ship he saw. The next plane up the elevator was Bob Weatherholt's torpedo bomber. This one was loaded with a full tank of gas. Weatherholt, calmly smoking a cigarette, flicked it over the side just before the catapult operated, grinned and took off. The third plane came up, loaded with gas and a torpedo. Jerry Falls, the gunner, Bob Jensen, the radio man, and Pisarski shook hands. They stepped up to the torpedo bomber, took their places, and taxied to the catapult. Pisarski's eyes were glued to the deck-edge controller, who watched the catapult light console and used his fingers to signal the catapult launch officer. The clenched fist meant hold, 1 finger up meant get ready, and 2 fingers up meant clear to fire. The controller's fist was clenched as the plane was hooked up. Then he raised 1 finger. Pisarski turned to face the launch officer, waited, and waited. It was 7:30 a.m. For 15 minutes, a squall lay between the ships of Taffy 3 and Admiral Kurita's force. Only a few salvo splashes had come in remarkably near the White Plains and Fanshawe Bay. Given the circumstances and the absence of Japanese spotter planes, Admiral Sprague used this respite to ask Admiral Kinkaid down south if he might move the whole protective carrier force toward the safety of the battleship fleet. The answer was no. So Admiral Sprague knew that the escort carriers were regarded as expendable. If they had to be sacrificed to save the main body of Kinkaid's fleet, then that was how it would be. They could maneuver east or west, but they could not head south to safety. Whether or not they could have achieved safety was questionable. The small carrier had been operating for many weeks without dockyard attention, and 17 knots was regarded as a good speed for them. The Yamato, the Japanese super battleship, had a flank speed almost twice that of the Kaiser carriers. The controller held 1 finger up, waiting for the bridge command. Pisarski could not understand it. "She's charged! Let her go!" he shouted. He looked at Commander Bohr and called to him, "Let me go!" Bohr pointed silently to the enemy at the top. The captain had headed downwind to try to escape the enemy. 1 Japanese cruiser was moving around the northeast flank of the carriers, and salvos were beginning to fall close. The Japanese radar was not nearly as advanced as the American, so Admiral Kurita's gunners relied on an old device. Their various salvos were colour-coded. A green series of splashes would be followed by a red series, then yellow, and each series came closer to the Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, and Gambier Bay. The cruiser was moving at 30 knots and would soon have a direct shot at the Gambier Bay. The salvos increased in concentration. Captain Vegg was busily manoeuvring the ship on the principle that lightning does not strike twice in the same place. As soon as 1 salvo of shells plunked into the water, the captain turned in that direction. Then came another salvo, and he turned again. As Weatherholt was launched, salvos straddled the ship. It was 7:25 a.m. The range was close enough now that Admiral Sprague ordered the carriers to open fire with their 5-inch guns. The gun on the fantail began shooting. Pisarski got the cut signal, shut off the engine of the torpedo bomber, jumped out and ran for the bridge. "What's the matter?" he shouted. "The catapult is charged!" Commander Bohr held up his fist to signal hold. Pisarski ran back to the plane and ordered FS and Jensen out. He intended to fly the plane himself. As the signal was to hold, he jumped out and ran again to the bridge, calling to Bohr, "We can take off without wind." It was true. While the ship was in harbour at Espiritu Santo, the torpedo bombers had been fitted with new twin-barrel Honeywell carburetors, which were promised to increase engine efficiency. Carrier doctrine, however, said you must not take off except into the wind. With salvos falling all around the ship, Commander Bohr was not about to argue with the captain. "Sure, sure," he said to Pisarski, and then pointed at the catapult. The torpedo bomber was just then being shot off pilotless. It took off beautifully, just as Bowski had said it would. It climbed for a moment, then flipped over on its left side and went into the water. The last plane had left the Gambier Bay. It was 7:50 a.m. Lieutenant Stewart, in charge of the first 8 fighters that had left the Gambier Bay before dawn, was totally unaware of what was happening. Initially, his mission was to support the ground troops on Leyte with strafing, bombing and rocket attacks. This activity consumed a large amount of fuel, so around 7:30 a.m. he was considering a return to the Gambier Bay for fuel when he called the air controller. He learned that the Japanese had arrived in force off Samar and that his carrier was under attack and could not land any planes. The same was true for all the other carriers of Taffy 1, 2 and 3. They were running from destruction, and their planes had to take care of themselves. The alternative was Tacloban Airfield, which was in worse shape on the 25th than it had been the day before when Zola landed there. The night's rain had made a sticky mess of the dirt runway, but there was no other option. By the time Stewart brought his flight of 8 over to Tacloban, around 100 planes were orbiting. They came from the 16 escort carriers of Admiral Sprague's command and from Halsey's fleet carriers offshore. They shared a common problem: no place else to go. The first fighter in the pattern made a pass over the field and then landed, but his gear caught in the mud and the plane nosed over in the middle of the runway, blocking it. The next plane, desperate, landed in the sand on the seaward side of the runway. It bumped down and bounced along, but landed safely. That was what counted. Thereafter, planes began landing on sand and runway every few seconds. Some nosed over, some came in hard, and the landing gear crumbled beneath them, some caught fire, but the planes continued to land. Hundreds of soldiers appeared to help pull and drag planes off the runways and clear spots so more planes could land. The Tacloban field was like a giant beehive with worker bees carrying off the injured to make room for more to land. After Commander Huxtable received the order from the flagship to attack, he led his 6 fellow torpedo pilots toward the enemy. As long as the planes were under 1,000 feet, they could see the Japanese ships below. To make an attack, however, they had to gain altitude and come down through the clouds. The weather was so bad that a high-altitude attack seemed unlikely to be successful, and the flagship had ordered immediate action. Below, Huxtable could see the 4 cruisers and 4 battleships in the gloom, or at least that was what he thought he saw. Without a doubt, he could also see the American destroyers and destroyer escorts running in to make torpedo attacks on the big Japanese ships to stop the punishment of the escort carriers. Huxtable did not even know what loads the other torpedo bombers were carrying. His own plane had only ammunition for the guns, but at least, he said to himself, he could give the enemy a scare. He headed down in a shallow dive on the starboard side of the line of cruisers. He could see the red balls of anti-aircraft tracers coming up as he dived at 190 knots. Huxtable came in to about 2,500 yards. The anti-aircraft fire grew more intense, and he pulled up in a wide circle. The Japanese kept shooting with 5-inch shells, and he flew through the smoke of the bursts, which were so close. Not knowing what Admiral Kincaid had said to Admiral Sprague that morning, Huxtable volunteered the information to Bendix that the best course for the carrier force was due south. There was no comment. Lieutenant Bassett was right behind Commander Huxtable when they took off from the carrier. As Huxtable dove for the cruisers, Bassett was on his wing. Huxtable took the second ship in the column, and Bassett peeled off to attack the lead ship, a Mummy-class cruiser. Bassett had 2 bombs. As he dropped the first at 2,000 feet, the anti-aircraft fire became intense, and the torpedo bomber was hit and began to shudder. Immediately he dropped the second bomb and pulled out of the 35 degrees dive at 1,000 feet, turning into the clouds ahead of the cruiser. He did not see the results of his bombing, but he heard no explosions and believed his 2 500-pound bombs had not been fused and did not explode even if they struck the target. Just then he was more concerned with the shuddering torpedo bomber. How badly was it damaged? He climbed to 8,000 feet on instruments deep in the clouds. When he emerged, his crewmen could check the damage. The starboard horizontal stabilizer had been hit from below, with a hole 10 inches wide blown in the bottom side, and the shell emerging to make a hole 18 inches wide at the top. When Bassett pulled back the stick, he felt a binding, but that was all. The instruments responded properly. The question was how much structural damage had been suffered and whether the plane could fly to a landing place. Radioman Holohan found a piece of shrapnel in his compartment and a hole in the port window, but that was all the damage. Bassett flew toward Tacloban Field, but when he arrived, so many planes were stacked up in the sky that the field was accepting emergency landings only. He circled for an hour. Meanwhile, the others in his group arrived, and he joined them to land at Dagami Airfield shortly after 11 a.m. Ensign Crocker had also joined up with Commander Huxtable. His plane, like Huxtable's, had no bomb load. In the heat of battle off Samar, Lieutenant Crocker defied orders to stay back and flew in low to divert Japanese anti-aircraft fire. He sustained significant damage to his aircraft and, after attempting to guide a downed torpedo bomber's crew to safety, continued attacking Japanese destroyers, despite his severe limitations and lack of support. Lieutenant Schroyer, who had joined Commander Huxtable, initially struggled with visibility due to cloud cover, but eventually hit a Tone-class cruiser with 2 bombs, leaving it dead in the water. Schroyer's bravery and effectiveness were crucial in the chaotic battle. Lieutenant Gallagher, in a torpedo bomber, made a direct run on a Japanese cruiser despite severe fuel limitations. His torpedo attack was unobserved, but his damaged plane eventually had to ditch in the water. Gallagher and his crew were seen by Crocker but were never recovered, highlighting the high cost of the battle. Lieutenant Weatherholt, who initially waited for other planes, eventually joined a torpedo plane to attack a battleship. His coordination and perseverance under difficult conditions were vital in the fight against the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Roby, one of the first to launch, conducted multiple strafing runs against Japanese destroyers and cruisers. Even after running out of ammunition, his continued efforts to harass and distract enemy forces were significant. Lieutenant Bennett, flying a torpedo bomber, separated from his group but continued the fight by strafing Japanese cruisers and battleships. His actions helped divert enemy fire from other planes, demonstrating the critical role of individual actions in the battle. Lieutenant Joe McGraw, escorting Huxtable's torpedo planes, made numerous strafing runs on a Fuso-class battleship and observed significant damage to a Japanese cruiser. His persistence in attacking despite heavy fire was noteworthy. Lieutenant Phillips and his squadron faced mechanical issues but continued their attacks. Their relentless efforts contributed to the overall disruption of the Japanese formations. Lieutenant Elwood's repeated runs on Japanese cruisers provided crucial support to bombers by drawing anti-aircraft fire, even when his own aircraft was suffering mechanical problems. Lieutenant Dugan concentrated on attacking Japanese destroyers, contributing to the broader effort to protect the American carriers. The actions of these pilots, despite overwhelming odds, were instrumental in the battle. They not only contributed to the damage inflicted on the Japanese fleet, but also played a key role in the broader defense efforts. Their bravery and tenacity under fire were crucial in the face of a superior enemy. Later in the day, the surface battle was just as intense as the aerial fight. As Admiral Kay's force descended, the destroyers and destroyer escorts became the crucial defense between the carriers and disaster. At just before 7 a.m., these small but valiant ships came under heavy fire from the Japanese fleet. The destroyer Johnston led the charge, firing torpedoes and evading enemy fire by ducking into a rain squall. The destroyers Hull and H-Man, along with the destroyer escort Roberts, followed in the attack. Despite their efforts, the Johnston and Hull were eventually sunk. The men of the Gambier Bay were familiar with the H-Man and its crew. Lieutenant Bucky Darren, aboard the H-Man that day, was involved in damage control when a Japanese shell struck. He had volunteered to help spot Japanese planes but was killed, along with 3 others, when he returned to the bridge to request a new assignment. Captain Hathaway, who had been in the fire control tower, survived, but Darren's second chance at life was cut short within 24 hours. The destroyers and destroyer escorts played a crucial role in saving the carriers, but the cost was significant. The Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were lost. The carriers, though not entirely unscathed, survived largely due to the fierce defence mounted by these ships. At 7:10 a.m., the Kinnin Bay was the first carrier hit when Japanese salvos began to fall around her. Despite taking 15 shells, the Kinnin Bay was not significantly damaged. The Kitkun Bay was straddled by shells but remained intact, while the St. Lo, another carrier, was hit by a kamikaze later in the day, leading to its sinking after fires could not be controlled. The Gambier Bay, however, bore the brunt of the attack. When Admiral Spruance manoeuvred to distance his force from the enemy, the Gambier Bay was positioned at the exposed end of the line. By 8:10 a.m., Japanese shells struck the flight deck, igniting fires and causing casualties. Seaman Deyo, tasked with fighting the fires, was overwhelmed and instead began assisting the wounded. This was the first time escort aircraft carriers faced such a formidable assault from capital ships. Despite the Japanese recognizing the valor of the defending pilots and crews, the official reports understated the damage done. The Gambier Bay and Keenan Bay were prime targets, and as the battle intensified, the Gambier Bay became increasingly vulnerable. Captain Vuegg managed to predict the shooting pattern initially, but as the Japanese cruisers closed to within 10,000 yards, the intensity of their fire increased. Pisarski, witnessing the chaos, saw a torpedo bomber loaded with fuel and a live torpedo caught in a fire. As he moved to the bridge to assess the situation, he found several men injured and the battle continuing with fierce intensity. He turned and went back to the flight deck to watch the enemy come down on them like foxes in a henhouse. He saw the battleship Yamato firing, the largest ship he had ever seen in his life. Suddenly, another salvo dropped very near the ship, and almost immediately Piskai felt the engines slowing. He looked up and saw the battle begin to droop. The ship had been travelling at more than 17 knots, but suddenly the speed dropped to 11 knots. No shells from that salvo had actually struck the Gambier Bay, but one had missed so closely that it had smashed a hole in the plates just by the forward engine room. It was 8:20. Oiler John Loranda was on duty in the after engine room with Commander Sanders, Lieutenant Malgrave, Firan, Richard Pearson, and Chief Walter Calber. Loranda had stood the 12-4 watch that morning and had cleaned out the filters in the hours of darkness, as was their habit, in order to pump the sludge while leaving no trace by daylight. When the call came to battle stations, he rushed below. Commander Sanders warned him that they were under attack. For the first hour, all they knew of the attack was the account piped down from the bridge where Chaplain Carlson was reporting and the orders given to Person, who had the earphones. Person adjusted the throttles every time a change in speed was ordered, and Lemarand adjusted the condensers. The first real feeling of war was when a shell came through the flight deck and knocked out one of the engine room's vent blowers. Then came the shell that blew in the plates next to number 1 boiler. In a few moments the water was coming in. "Get the hell out of here!" shouted Commander Sanders. They secured the boilers so they would not blow up. By this time they were waist-deep in water, and the ship was listing to port. Loranda headed for the hangar deck and crawled under one of the planes that had not gotten off. Just before they left, Commander Sanders called from the after engine room and reported that they had secured. Then communications went out, and he climbed the ladder since the forward engine room supplied power to the forward part of the ship. For a time there was no power forward. Then the whole load was switched to the number 3 generator. On the bridge the equipment was working, but when they slowed to 11 knots, the range between the ship and the enemy began closing with frightening speed. The American aircraft above and the Japanese were attacking all the while, and the destroyers and destroyer escorts were launching their torpedoes. But the Japanese seemed hardly to notice. As far as the men of the Gambier Bay could tell, the tempo of fire became furious, and the ship was hit by nearly every salvo. 2 portable electric BGE pumps had been placed in operation in the engine room by the damage control party a minute after the plates caved in. Soon came a report that bulkhead 100 had split, and that meant the machine shop forward was flooding. Up the ladder from the damage control centre came Robert Plattner, one of the oldest warrant officers with 21 years of naval service, with a young machinist mate slung across his shoulders. He reached the hangar deck when the force of an explosion blew the injured youngster off his shoulder, but slowed the flying shrapnel, which penetrated and immobilized Plattner's neck. At 9 a.m., Lieutenant Aviation Mechanic First Class Martin, the Skinner Uniflow engine specialist, and warrant machinist James Buford abandoned the pumps in the forward engine room and found their way to the hangar deck. When another shell exploded, Engineer Martin suffered a broken upper arm and a broken knee. He noticed Buford with a hole in his head and managed to drag him to the sponson, where he could tell the injury was fatal. Unable to inflate the life jackets, Martin clung on to Buford, slipped into the water, and found a life raft on the flight deck. Seaman Deo was hit by shrapnel in the back and leg. The force of the blow blew off one shoe and his shirt. He saw his friend Gene Murray a little further along and ran to him. Just as he reached Murray, a shell blew off his friend's head and fractured 2 of Deo's ribs. He watched for what seemed like 2 or 3 minutes as Murray's headless body continued to move, and then slowly slumped to the deck and was still. The salvos were coming in every other minute, and at least 1 shell per salvo was doing damage. Those shells that hit the superstructure did very little damage, as they were armour-piercing and went right through without exploding. The damage was done by shells that hit just short of the ship or at the waterline and exploded below. Seaman Heinel felt 1 shell come through the ship as he was walking from the port magazine to the starboard to check on the men there. Since the ship was listing, as he came onto the catwalk under the flight deck, he saw the hole through both sides of the ship where the shell had passed. When Heinel reached the starboard magazine, he found Seaman Mike Williams, who had been telling him a few days before that he was about to be returned to the United States for duty. His 2 elder brothers had been killed in action, and his mother had asked the Red Cross to bring him home. The Navy had acquiesced, and Mike Williams's orders were being cut. As soon as this engagement ended, Williams was to be flown back to the United States. Heinel spent a few moments talking to Williams and Seaman Katowski, who was also on duty there. Then he went back to his own post. As he reached the magazine, the ship shuddered from the impact of another shell, and the lights went out. That shell also killed Mike Williams at his post. Heinel went out onto the catwalk again, since he could not see inside, and as he came out he saw another shell strike and Katowski's left arm disappear. He got to a phone and called for a corpsman, but the corpsman never appeared. In a minute or 2, Katowski was dead. The corpsman was killed en route to the catwalk. Aviation machinist's mate. Third-class PNC was on the catwalk when an explosion behind him knocked him down. As he scrambled to his feet, he saw that the first shell had knocked out his oxygen room. Where his oxygen room had been was now a large smouldering hole. He moved up the port catwalk forward, and his head was tumbling with thoughts. What about his tombstone with the inscription, "Lost at Sea, age 9 years"? And what would his family say when they learned he had been killed? Poxnack reached the flight deck and saw bodies lying on the blood-stained wooden deck. He headed for the parachute packing light lock. When he arrived, he saw that it had been turned into a first aid station. Just behind him came the flight surgeon, Commander Stewart, followed by 2 enlisted men, one of whom was aviation machinist's mate third-class Marty Showers, lying on a stretcher, badly injured. Commander Stewart asked Poxnack to move over since he needed that space to work on the wounded man. PNC stepped back, and the surgeon knelt down by the stretcher. Just then, a shell fragment burst through the flight deck and killed Surgeon Stewart. Poxnack saw other men fall and heard air crewman G.C. Phillips shout, "I'm hit!" PNC was hit too by small fragments in the hand and legs. He looked at the stretcher. Surgeon Stewart's body was lying across that of the injured sailor in a pool of blood. The compartment began to get hot, and PNC went out the port side of the light lock to the catwalk. Photographer's mate Second Class Johnson remained at his battle station on the catwalk after the landing signal officer's platform. He leaned over the side just as one shell hit the motor whaleboat and blew it apart. He watched, fascinated, as shells continued to go completely through the ship and then explode 300 yards further along. He also saw shells ricocheting off the flight deck without exploding, indicating the close range from which the approaching cruisers were firing. He saw aerographer First Class John Ammon clamber up onto the flight deck from the catwalk and begin to sprint toward the island. When he was halfway across, an explosion below caused the flight deck to undulate like a wave, and Ammon fell flat on his face. He lay there, jumped up, and hobbled into the island structure. The whole performance had probably consumed 10 seconds, but it seemed like an hour. Johnson decided to go down to the photo lab and pick up his dress blues. He had them made up in a tight package with a white hat in the centre. Months earlier, he had been impressed by the tale of one old-timer who described his woes after he lost his ship because he had no dress blues. He could not go ashore on liberty for months until they reached port and he could get re-outfitted. Johnson had determined this would never happen to him, and now, with shells exploding all around, his dress blues were foremost in his mind. He worked his way back to the passageway that led onto the gallery deck and the photo lab. He encountered heavy black smoke, but held the door to the light lock open and let the breeze clear the air so that he could see. It was lucky that he did, for 8 feet in front of him was a gaping hole through the passageway deck down to the hangar deck. There was no way to get past, so he turned back toward his station, saying goodbye to his dress blues. This time on the catwalk, he encountered Seaman First Class Gilman, one of the fire rescue team. Gilman was slumped against the bulkhead, crying and holding his arms in front of him. Johnson came up and saw why. Gilman's abdomen was ripped open, and he was trying to hold his intestines in. "I'm ruined!" he kept crying. "I'm ruined! I'm ruined!" And he did not look up as Johnson went by. Johnson passed one of the 40mm sponsons and saw one of the ammunition passers, a real tough guy, who had been complaining since they left port. "When are we going to see some real action?" Now, the ammunition passer was standing at the gun, just gazing off into the distance, eyes glassy, a string of slobber hanging from his jaw. "Well, buddy," said Johnson, "is this enough action for you?" The ammunition passer looked right through him, did not recognize him or answer. He was blowing little bubbles. Johnson walked back to the very end of the catwalk, where he saw a lookout in a chair, his glasses turned out. He was sitting there as calmly as if he were in his backyard, listening to the Yankees playing the Red Sox, humming a little tune. "How you doing?" Johnson asked. "Fine, how you doing?" came the reply. "Okay," Johnson said. "Pardon me," the lookout spoke into his chest microphone. "Tone-class cruiser bearing 060, now 3,000 yards." He turned back to Johnson. "What were you saying, pal?" Lieutenant Lynch's battle station, after being relieved by Lieutenant Commander Gorn as officer of the deck, was at the 5-inch gun on the fantail. He had received orders to begin firing at 7:45 a.m. and had been firing steadily since. On the 6th round they hit a cruiser, and about 3 rounds later they made a hit on another one. Then they were told to stop firing because someone in gunnery control believed the 5-inch was drawing fire to the ship, and that it might stop if they quit irritating the Japanese. When the fires started, The 5-inch gun crew broke out 2 hoses and put out several fires. Then came the shell that knocked out the forward engine room. A few moments later, orders from the bridge instructed them to flood the magazines. Gunner F.S. Hughes supervised the flooding. Then Lynch reported to the bridge, which gave him orders to begin firing again. But when they tried to fire the gun, they discovered the power was out. Switching to manual, they found that the rammer had been jammed by one of those shaking near misses. They were working with the gun when several men from the hangar deck appeared wounded. The worst hurt was machinist's mate 3rd Class Macmillan with a mutilated arm. Lieutenant Lynch broke out the first aid kit and began patching up the wounded. Seaman 1st Class J.V. Hammond was the talker on the bridge, and he was aware of everything going on as various divisions reported in to state damage and the remedies that were being taken. Then, just below him, he felt a tremendous explosion. "There goes the pilot house," he said to himself. And it was true. On the deck below, helmsman Berra Dahlstrom was having serious difficulty with the steering. Several times the power had failed, and the helm had not responded to his attempts to turn. Then the power went out altogether, and the captain ordered the after-manual steering. Dahlstrom called the captain. "Do you still have any control, sir?" "Hard left rudder," came the order. Just then came that big explosion that had jolted Lieutenant Hammond. Most of the pilot house directly behind Dahlstrom was blasted to pieces, with the men in it. Dahlstrom felt something hit his foot, and he lost all feeling in it, as if the foot was gone. All the instruments were knocked out. From the bridge came the captain's voice. "Helmsman, have you any more control?" "No, sir. Everything is dead in that after-steering compartment." Quartermaster Haggerty and 3 others were in water a foot deep. The water was seeping in through the hatch that led to the 5-inch gun's ammunition locker. After Gunner Hughes had flooded the locker, another 8-inch shell from a Japanese cruiser had sprung open the hatch, and the water was now pouring in. They wondered just how long they could last when a hit somewhere knocked out all power. Lieutenant ODM was in his aerology office listening to Chaplain Carlson's account of the battle over the public address system when suddenly the box gave a squawk and quit working. The public address system was knocked out. ODM had been smelling the acrid cordite mixed with the smoke from the ship's stacks for an hour and was as used to it as he would ever be. Suddenly the odour changed. The cordite became predominant, and the stink of burning diesel fuel fell off. At the same time, he felt the motion of the ship stopping. He began stuffing his classified materials into weighted bags. Aerographer's mate John Ammon was back at his station after running that dangerous message to the captain. ODM told Ammon he was going to airplot to check if the abandoned ship order had been given. "If I don't get back here and you hear that the captain has ordered abandoned ship, then be sure you get these bags off and get the men off," ODM said, then headed for airplot. Chief Montgomery was on the flight deck moving from one fire to another as the 8-inch shells from the Japanese cruisers and a few 12 and 14-inch shells from the battleships hit the ship or nearby, sending white-hot fragments onto the wooden deck. He saw Chief Flanders running down the catwalk with an armload of fire hoses. Flanders came to the point where Johnson had nearly fallen through, looked and leaped across the enormous hole without a pause. He kept on running forward. Suddenly Montgomery remembered that he had forgotten to put the flame cover over his bunk that morning. He went below to the chief petty officer quarters. He found that a medical crew had taken over the writing table and was operating as their emergency lights blinked on and off. They were standing in water ankle deep. Montgomery went to his bunk, reached under his pillow, and pulled out a pocket copy of the New Testament, where he kept his wife's picture. He put it in his shirt pocket, spread the flame cover over the bunk, and went back to the flight deck to join the damage control parties. He was sent with 3 men to officer country on the deck below, but when they arrived, the officer in charge said he had plenty of help and told them to go further forward, where the ship had just been hit. Montgomery led his men forward along the catwalk, following another group. Suddenly, another 8-inch shell struck the ship. The group of men in front of him seemed to disintegrate, and he was knocked down. He picked himself up. He was the only one alive. He began walking along the catwalk back to officers' country. Radio man 3rd Class McCollum was standing on the catwalk outside the radio shack, watching the battle. He had no duty since he had stood the morning watch. The shell that stopped the ship knocked McCollum off his feet, and when he got up, he saw that one end of the passageway had been hit squarely. Many of his shipmates were dead or wounded. The cries began, "Corpsman! Corpsman!" After the loudspeaker system went out, some of the men around McCollum began seeking other parts of the ship on the theory that lightning did not strike twice in the same place, just as the captain had reasoned. An officer appeared and directed them to get out of the passageways and go below to the officer staterooms if they did not have a battle station. A half-dozen of them went. No sooner had they crowded into the 6 bunk room than a shell hit nearby, and the room was filled with flying shrapnel. Several men were killed, others were wounded. A bit of shrapnel banged against McCollum's helmet but did not penetrate. "Oh God, please save me," he prayed. Then someone yelled, "Let's get the hell out of here!" Lieutenant Cooming had been watching the battle on radar in the Combat Information Center and informing the bridge, but when the Japanese ships closed on the carrier, the radar was ineffective. It did not matter. The lookouts on the edges of the flight deck had a better view and could tell Captain Veg all he needed to know. Still, Cumming stayed at his post, giving what assistance he could as the battle continued. Lieutenant McClendon had very little to do as landing signal officer, but as flight deck officer he supervised the fighting of fires and the clean-up of debris. As the battle continued, he saw men fall dead and wounded. He saw one man pick up a red-hot nose cap from a shell burning into the deck, walk over and heave it overboard. He did not see the man's hands, but he knew how badly they must have been burned. Lieutenant Malgrave was in the after engine room when that crippling shell struck at 8:40 a.m. The salvo was the same that hit the island and knocked out the steering. The shell in the engine room came through the port side, pierced the No. 3 boiler, and went into the generating tubes. It knocked the quick-closing valve off boiler No. 3. Water tender 3rd Class Boren had to use the fuel oil throttle valve to close off the oil supply. When Lieutenant Malgrave saw the size of the hole in the ship's skin, he knew there was no way of closing it. He ordered the engine room secured and abandoned before they all drowned. Chief Heald lifted the safety valves before they left, and then all men went up the ladders to the 2nd deck and another set of ladders to the hangar deck, where they scattered. No one was injured. After Peasy's torpedo bomber had been jettisoned, he stood on the flight deck looking at the Japanese ships for quite a while. The idea crossed his mind that perhaps the Japanese would come alongside and board. Peasy had read many tales of the age of fighting sail as a boy. He touched his .38 caliber revolver and the survival knife at his belt, looked at those ships as they grew bigger and bigger, then, having no place to go, Peasy automatically headed for his stateroom. When he got there, he saw that his locker was open and the whiskey was all gone. He took off his helmet and goggles, tossed them on the bunk, and sat down to collect his wits. Just then Lieutenant Bisbee appeared in the doorway with an open bottle of scotch in his hand. "Need a drink?" he asked, offering the bottle. Peasy took a drink and then followed Bisbee into the adjoining stateroom. There he saw a pile of Composite Squadron 10 pilots huddled beneath a huge teepee formed by stacking all the mattresses that could be collected from nearby staterooms. From the teepee came the discordant sounds of drunken voices trying to harmonize. Peasy looked at his friends. Most of the bottles were empty, and the pilots were all pie-eyed. Just then the shell struck in the after engine room, and the ship went dead in the water. In less than a minute, Peasy said, "Better get these guys ready to go." "They'll be all right," said Bisbee. Peasy headed for the catwalk, but 2 of the officers were missing. He encountered Lieutenant McClendon. "Where were Bell and Holland?" McClendon asked. "They're coming," said Peasy. Bell and Holland were outside, getting the enlisted men moving. It was 8:45 a.m. Captain Veg surveyed his ship hopelessly. The steering was gone and the power was gone. Even if the steering had functioned, the final blow was the shutdown of the after engine room, for that single shell had sealed the fate of the Gambier Bay. The ship was dead in the water, and there were no more chances. The captain ordered all classified materials thrown overboard in those weighted bags. On the port side, he could see the approaching division of Japanese cruisers now scarcely a mile away. On the starboard came a division of destroyers, and behind them the battleships. The Gambier Bay was being hit by shells from both sides every few seconds. There was only one order, and he gave it. "Abandon ship," he called. It was 8:50 a.m. when Lieutenant Malgrave reached the hangar deck from the engine room. He saw that it was covered with oil from broken lines. He heard the fire alarm bell ringing, and when a seaman came running by, he called to him, "Why is the bell ringing?" "Abandoned ship," shouted the seaman, and then he sped away. Malgrave went to the quarterdeck behind the ventilation trunk. Just then, an explosion blew behind him, and he saw sparks and flames in the air. He did not even turn around to see the damage, but hurried to number 3 sponson. He inflated his lifebelt and got machinist's mate second-class Top Chusey to help him cut loose the cargo net. He and Top Chusey climbed down the net and then had to jump 4 feet into the water. Behind them, the other men of the engine room did not bother with the net, but jumped overboard from the sponson. Even with the ship's list, it was a long jump, but the flames were right behind them. Radioman Third Class McCollum responded when someone said, "Let's get the hell out." He moved toward the radio shack to see what had happened to his buddies. He found a huge hole blown in the passageway to the room. There was no way for him to reach it. He fumbled his way through smoke to the side of the ship, found a lifeline someone had hung over the edge, went down hand over hand, dropped into the water, and began swimming. Photographer's mate Johnson heard the order, "Abandoned ship," but he heard it only once. He asked his lookout friend to call and verify the order. The talker called, but there was no answer. The phones were dead. Johnson saw rafts being cut loose on the deck and lifelines being thrown over by the gun crews. A boatswain's mate on the after 40 gun lined up his crew and gave the word to go over the side. The first man went, the second man went. Johnson stepped up. "If you guys don't want to go, by God I'm going!" And he slid down the rope at a good clip. About halfway down, he looked outboard and saw another shell hit the water. But not only the water. Johnson watched a man who had just jumped get caught up in the spout that arose from the shell, his figure raised 40 feet above the surface of the water. Just then, Johnson's feet touched the water, and he dropped in and sank like a stone. He struggled upward. Only then did he realize he was wearing his steel helmet and shoes, and was carrying a canvas bag loaded with film magazines over his shoulder. He shucked off the bag and helmet and struggled to the surface. Then he inflated his lifebelt by blowing. It seemed to take forever. Lieutenant Cumming heard the order and left the Combat Information Center with several others. They went to the adjacent catwalk and found a rope. Cumming slid down the rope hand over hand, scraping off some skin. He was wearing a KPO life preserver, which did not have to be inflated. Just after he hit the water, he remembered the old story about the suction of a sinking ship dragging men under, so he swam rapidly away from the Gambier Bay. He bumped into a man, and then saw that the man was dead. He felt around for identification, but found none. He stripped off the dead man's KPO life jacket. Someone else could use it better. Most were abandoning from the port side, where the heavy list made the distance to the water shorter than on the starboard. Seaman Heinel went to the starboard side, cut down a raft, and dropped it into the water. He clambered down the line, but by the time he reached the bottom, he saw that the raft was already filled with other men who had been swimming and was on its way. He waited for another raft to come by from the forward part of the ship and climbed aboard. He took off his shoes and helmet, threw them overboard, and then joined the others to paddle away from the ship. Chief Montgomery picked himself up from the fatal blast on the catwalk and headed back for officers' country. He met Lieutenant Bell and Lieutenant Holland in the companionway. Bell said they were getting ready to abandon ship. "Wait a minute, Chief," he added, and ducked into his stateroom. He emerged with a half-filled bottle of scotch. They all had a drink, and Bell put the bottle carefully back in the room. Then they started toward the port railing on the bow. Montgomery went over the side and came up near Lieutenant Courtney, who was riding a mattress. "Come on aboard," said Lieutenant Courtney, waving genially. That seemed an eminently sensible idea, so Montgomery joined him on the mattress. Bell and Holland had disappeared. Lieutenant McClendon and Lieutenant Pisarski made their way to the port rail too. McClendon looked back. "Let 'em go. I'll go first and you follow me." He loosened his helmet, took one look back at the bridge, saw that it was empty, and went down the rope hand over hand. Pisarski started down when McClendon was a third of the way to the bottom. The man behind Pisarski slid down with his feet onto Peasy's hand and knocked his grip loose. Pisarski fell on McClendon and knocked him into the water. McClendon came up sputtering. "You stoop!" he shouted at Pisarski, and then tried to get his helmet off before it dragged him down. He looked up. They were under the overhang of the flight deck, certainly no place to be. He turned back to Pisarski. "Get as far away as you can in case she blows up." Then McClendon began to swim. He looked at his Mae West and decided not to inflate it just then, not until he had cleared the ship. He swam on, and Pisarski swam after him. When Lieutenant Odom heard the call to abandon ship, he was on the starboard catwalk. He did not relish the idea of going off the high side, so he worked around through the passageway in the centre of the ship, down the stairs to his room, heading for the port side. Near his stateroom, he was thrown against the bulkhead by an explosion in the forward elevator machine room. Shell fragments ricocheted along the space, but he was not hit. He decided to stop at the stateroom, where he found Lieutenant Bell, his bunkmate, who had brought Holland back after seeing Chief Montgomery. Bell was collecting survival gear, a pilot's raft, a very pistol, and various other items including a chart of the area, a compass, and several Mae West life jackets. Odom pocketed a palm-sized mirror and stuck an unopened package of cigarettes in his shirt pocket. Then he joined the others to move out. Bell remembered the bottle of whiskey. "This isn't going to do anybody else any good, so let's drink it." He took a swig and passed the bottle. All the others drank, and the dead soldier was tossed aside. "Good luck, fellows," said Lieutenant Bell, and he led the way carrying a mattress. The pilots and Holland followed behind, but Odom was cut off by a charging group of men from below decks who were determined to get out and get out in a hurry. By the time they had passed him, he had decided that his original idea of going out the port side was sounder. Even though Bell and the others had gone back to the starboard, Odom went to the side, unlaced his shoes, dropped his helmet and his sidearm and holster, and slid down a heavy rope. The list, he estimated, was 40 degrees. His shoes helped drag him under when he hit the water, so he kicked them off and then swam away from the ship. When Quartermaster Haggie and his 3 shipmates heard the call to abandon ship, they headed for the fantail. Fires were everywhere. They could see them burning in the living spaces, but they did not have to go that way. They hurried on. Just as they began climbing the last ladder, an armor-piercing shell went through the port side, not 20 feet behind them, through the tailor shop and the barber shop. When they reached the fantail, they did not hesitate in taking the 30-foot jump to the water. Haggie came up and inflated his life belt immediately. He saw Quartermaster Dugan about 40 feet away with a life ring. He swam over and grabbed onto it. Together they began swimming away as far from the ship as they could get. They had swum 60 feet when a Japanese shell hit close by and forced them both underwater. With the effect of the explosion, they came up covered with red dye but otherwise unhurt. They were lucky. The marker shell had been the easy one. One of the 3 others of the salvo struck a loaded raft and blew the men apart. The others killed many swimmers with concussion, and Haggie and Dugan saw many swimmers floating face down and not moving. Enan Zola had left the drinking crowd in the middle of a song and gone to the ready room. He was there when the word came to abandon ship. The ready room talker on duty was Seaman Keki. Zola watched in awe as Keki carefully took off his headphones, coiled them in the prescribed manner for stowing headphones, wrapped the cord around them, and stowed them in the headset receptacle, just as if he was coming back in half an hour. Zola watched him and then hurried out to the electric winch motor on the bow, which, in better days, had been used to hoist aircraft aboard. Zola remembered that the last time he had been dunked, he had nearly drowned because he was wearing a .45 caliber automatic, a very pistol, 2 knives, and 2 canteens. They had kept him scrabbling around that wing tank, never able to pull himself up until he was exhausted. This time he stopped and leisurely took off his shoes and threw them over the side. Then he took off his helmet and threw it over the side. Enan Keith Cruz came up as Zola was looking into the water 30 feet down. "What are you waiting for?" Cruz asked. Zola started and then jumped out over Cruz towards the water. He hit hard, went down, and came up sputtering and swimming. He did not stop until he was exhausted. Then, and only then, he began to tread water and pulled the carbon dioxide cartridge on his Mae West. As it inflated, he took a moment to look around, thinking he must be half a mile from the ship. Then he looked up. There she was, right over him. He was under the catwalk. He realized then that he had gone off downwind and with the current, and the ship had drifted right along with him, still burning as brightly as ever. Now Zola did a nice easy breaststroke to take him back to the stern and watched the ship drift away from him. He had never been so glad to see the end of anything in his life. Lieutenant Commander Elmo, wearing a life jacket, went with the order to abandon ship and headed for the starboard catwalk. He remembered vividly that other day in September 1942, when the Wasp had gone down in the South Pacific to a Japanese torpedo, and how he had burned the fingertips on both hands in sliding down an unnoted rope with a 200-pound lieutenant who was knocked out, hanging between his legs. This time he was alone and went down slowly, carefully, hand over hand. In the water he soon found a raft, and on it one of the young ship's cooks with a cigar in his mouth. The cook smoked and led the men in songs. You would have thought they were going to an Elks picnic. Chief Flanders was on the flight deck on the starboard side. He saw a mess attendant, Lovett, sitting on the edge of the deck, seemingly dazed. He looked down. The catwalk beneath had been shot away. The man must have been standing there when it happened. Flanders made sure the man's life jacket was fastened. He looked around. Most men had already left the ship. This man had to go too, but he showed no indication of movement. Flanders pushed him over the side and then jumped. He came up near the man, who was now swimming and saying, "I can't swim," with every breath. Flanders inflated his own Mae West. It went up when the carbon dioxide bottle hissed out its gas, but then it deflated. He looked at it. A piece of shrapnel had cut a slice across the front. There he was, in the creek, without a paddle. He began to swim. Chief McCollum passed the word over all his circuits to abandon ship, then did it again, and then a third time, not waiting for acknowledgments he did not expect. He tossed aside the headset and his helmet. The other talker, Vogan, did the same. Just then they heard a tinkling and saw that a Japanese shell had passed through the glass windshield a few feet from their heads. McCollum went down the escape hatch on the outboard side of the open bridge. He waited at the catwalk for the crowd to thin out and stopped to light a cigarette. He saw an abandoned .45 automatic on the deck, picked it up, and fired 2 clips of cartridges at the nearest Japanese ship. He saw a KPO life jacket nearby and picked it up. He adjusted his own Mae West and grasped the line. He saw a life raft out in front of him in the water. Just then, a red salvo struck, and what had been a raft with 10 men aboard became a bundle of wreckage with chunks of bodies oozing blood onto the sea. A shell struck the ship near him, and he felt a stabbing pain in his left leg. At the same time, the wind was knocked out of him by 2 pieces of shrapnel that struck the KPO life vest against his chest. He saw the KPO smoking and knocked a piece of red-hot shrapnel out of it. Then he swung down the line and into the sea and swam away from the ship. Helmsman Dahlstrom heard the captain shout, "Abandon ship!" and looked around. The ladders and catwalks around the pilot house were all blown away. He climbed down the bulkheads like a monkey. All that was in his mind was that he was walking on a bomb. Down on the flight deck, he saw men he knew dead. He headed to the hangar deck, reasoning that it would not be such a long jump. He saw sailors running in all directions, shouting, "Let's get out of here! Let's go!" He saw that some of them were badly hurt, and he panicked. "Help! Help!" he shouted, and ran for the side. He found a rope and hurled himself down it. Just then, an ammunition locker topside exploded and blew up 6 men. Sheets of steel were tumbling over the side all around helmsman Dahlstrom. "Here I go," he said. "This is it." And flashes of his mother and father and home raced through his head. Then he prayed that God would not let anything happen to him. He began to swim. Lieutenant Lynch's talker on the 5-inch gun heard Chief McCollum give the word to abandon ship and passed it along. The men cut the floater net away from the side of the ship and jumped after it. All the 5-inch gun crew and the magazine crew made it safely. After Lieutenant Lynch finished bandaging Macmillan's arm, he helped the injured man over the side, then went back to check the port side for stragglers, but found none. He returned to the starboard side just as an 8-inch shell hit the fantail. The Japanese were not a mile off now, firing at point-blank range at the carrier and hitting her every few seconds. Lynch turned the corner and found Lieutenant Edmondson lying on the deck with his right leg nearly torn off. Aviation Ordnanceman First Class Kane and Lynch bandaged the wound and lifted Edmondson over the lifelines and threw him into the water. Kane then jumped after the lieutenant. Lynch started to take off his shoes. Just then, a whole salvo hit the ship and rocked the fantail so badly it nearly threw Lynch overboard. He forgot the shoes, grabbed the rest of the first aid supplies, and jumped. When aviation machinist's mate 3rd Class PNC heard the bell ringing on the bridge above him, he assumed it was the abandoned ship signal. Already he could see men strung out in the water behind the ship for 300 yards. He went to a life raft and pulled out his bayonet to cut the ropes, but some bright lad had also wired the life rafts. That was why so few of them were put in the water. But he was going to have a life raft, so he began hacking at the wire with his bayonet. He released 2 life rafts and part of another. The rest of it had been shot away. Then he jumped and began swimming for the rafts. By the time he reached them, they were nearly full of men. Adrift alone nearby was Robert G. Seek, in shock, gripping him. PNC latched onto a raft, and for the better part of 2 days and 2 nights, the 2 shipmates endured. Fred Deo never heard the abandoned ship order. One moment he was standing on the flight deck. Then came a tremendous explosion, and the next thing he knew, he was in the water 40 feet from the ship. He had been hit again by shrapnel in the head and right shoulder, but he could swim. He swam to some flotsam, which had lines attached, and began lashing together a makeshift raft. Another swimmer joined him. When he tried to climb up on the raft, Deo discovered that the explosion that had thrown him into the water had also blown off all his clothes but his shirt. Seaman Quinn was serving as talker at his 20mm gun on the port side when suddenly the phones went dead. He never heard the order to abandon ship. He stripped off the earphones, passed the word that they were out, and ran across the flight deck to find his buddy, Bud Dickerson, who was serving on gun number 4. All he could see at the gun was a pile of dead men. The ship was listing very badly, and he decided against trying to make it on the starboard side and ran to the fantail. He jumped, and when he came up, he saw one screw was completely out of the water. He also saw a shell hit a raft and blow one man 30 feet into the air. He swam away from the ship until he came to a life raft. Euler Loranda had hidden under a plane on the hangar deck. When he came up from the forward engine room, he lay there listening to the shells come in until suddenly one hit the plane under which he was lying and exploded. He came to in the water and swam straight for the Japanese fleet. Twice he was dazed by shells striking the water nearby, but he managed to maintain consciousness. After a long time, he reached a floating life net. When the captain saw that it was all over and the ship was nearly ready to capsize, he gave the abandoned ship order and then told Inen Basang to go to the code room and destroy the files. Veg said he would go to the hangar deck and be sure everyone was off the ship. Bang followed his instructions, dreading his way through the bodies of the dead. He threw the weighted bags over the side, then went back to the bridge. It was empty except for one man, the second talker, who had been dazed by a shell and was huddled in the corner. Bang tried to push him overboard, but the man was too big. He tried to reason with him, but the man was beyond reason. He had to leave him there. Bang then jumped to starboard, believing he would hit the water. but the list of the ship was so pronounced that he landed in the flag box, cutting his leg severely from ankle to groin. Bleeding, he lifted himself up and dived over again from the flag box, one leg caught in a lanyard as he went over, trailing a string of signal flags behind him. When he reached the water, the Japanese ships were almost alongside, and they were aiming their 6-inch guns at the bridge and pounding it mercilessly. The torpedo had no chance in that hail of shells. Commander Ballinger had made sure that the men who could make it were up from below to abandon ship. Then he slid over the side and found a life raft. Captain Vieweg went from the bridge down toward the hangar deck. As he left the bridge, another salvo smashed through the superstructure. He tried to go down the interior island ladders, but when he reached the hangar deck level, the smoke became so thick he could not see. For a moment he was overcome. Then he recovered and staggered up the stairs to the flight deck and off to go over the starboard side. He looked back. There were no moving men left aboard the ship. She was smoking, and from her interior gouts of flame occasionally burst forth. The Japanese were alongside, firing. When Captain Vieweg reached the safety of a life raft, he took time to look back at the Gambier Bay. She was listing heavily, and a Japanese cruiser was standing just about a mile off her beam. The captain noted that the Japanese were still firing and still missing. He did not have a very high regard for the quality of Japanese gunnery. The ship shuddered, began to move, and then capsized to port. The keel came up, she rolled, and settled in the water. At 9:11, by Executive Officer Ballinger's watch, the Gambier Bay sank to the bottom of the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest valleys of the sea. As she slid down, men on several life rafts gave 3 cheers for the old ship. Oiler Loranda noticed the starboard screw had been shot off. For months, Commander Ballinger had stressed the importance of keeping life jackets in good condition, but Loranda had neglected this advice. Now, with the belt folded around his middle, he found the rubber rotten and the belt useless. Without it, his chances of survival were slim. By 9:30 that morning, Captain Veg and Commander Ballinger began organizing the survivors. Other officers followed suit, creating 7 separate groups. They lashed together life rafts and collected sections of flight deck planking that had been blown off the ship. The wounded were the worst off, suffering from saltwater infections and exacerbated injuries. A few rubber rafts survived, and the most seriously wounded men were loaded onto these, while the unhurt clung to the lifelines around the sides. The wood and metal life rafts proved less efficient than expected. The water breakers, checked and refilled just 2 days earlier, had loose spigots or had been lost as the rafts were cut loose. No fresh water was available, and the rafts were in poor condition. The canvas lines holding the grating to the bottom rotted quickly and were replaced by other pieces of line. Lieutenant Malgrave swam to a raft and found Lieutenant Lynch and several men. Malgrave was exhausted, so he climbed into the raft briefly to rest before returning to the water to support the wounded. The men gathered rafts and planks, trying to increase their chances of survival by staying together. Medical supplies were used to treat wounds, with morphine being the most valuable for pain relief. Bandages slipped off in the water, and some men suffered greatly, such as water tender second-class Montz, who was believed to have a serious wound, but was found to be suffering from shock and died later. Machinist's mate. Third-class Cows, with a nearly severed arm, died from blood loss despite efforts to apply a tourniquet. Commander Ballinger swam out multiple times to rescue lone survivors, and Enan Barrows, a strong swimmer, made a game of saving men. Seaman Second-Class Earl Fetkin, with severe leg injuries, was kept in a raft, doped with morphine to manage the pain and prevent bleeding. On a raft captained by Commander Boris, Chaplain Harrison was helped aboard. Despite his nearsightedness, he chose to keep his glasses on. Lieutenant McClendon and Lieutenant Peasy, who had been separated, were eventually reunited. McClendon found himself in the Boris group, which joined the Lynch-Malgrave raft. Peasy joined hours later after being picked up by Ballinger. Seaman Deo, along with 18 others on a collection of rafts and flotsam, was isolated by a current. A Japanese destroyer passed by, taking pictures but not attacking. The other groups tried to converge, with Ballinger's group eventually merging with Deo's. As night fell, Lieutenant Odom found himself on a raft with 30 men, including Lieutenant Foley and Chief Boatswain's mate Polanski. Foley, the senior officer, instructed Odom to take command before sinking into a stupor and dying. The raft had only 1 canister of rations, 3 pounds of malted milk tablets, and no usable water. Odom, covered in oil and dye, assessed their situation and anticipated being picked up by a destroyer after the battle. The men continued to wait as the battle raged on. Admiral Kurita, confused and disturbed by the situation, ordered his forces to turn back. This decision, combined with the persistence of American forces and a breach of security, saved the remaining American ships. The cruiser seen by the survivors was the Chokai, which was eventually abandoned before nightfall. In that retreat, just after the Gambier Bay was sunk, Peasy saw one of the other cruisers, Tone or Haguro, come by the raft group. The men feared that they were going to be used for target practice, but instead they heard a signal given. They were that close by, and the men at the rail snapped to attention as the cruiser slid by. Admiral Ugaki, Kurita's chief of staff, commented very favourably on the unexpected bravery he witnessed in the behaviour of his enemies. He cited scattered patches of water coloured by dye-loaded shells and a considerably larger area of darkish red water, probably coloured by the fuel tanks of the Gambier Bay. Immediately beyond the latter were enemy survivors, some clinging to damaged cutters and some just drifting. "I wonder what these survivors thought on seeing our fleet. Even though they were in need of help, they gave no indication of it when they saw who we were," he remarked. As the Japanese began to retire, American fighters and bombers came back into the area and began attacking the cruisers and destroyers as they headed north. These were the attacks witnessed from the water by Lieutenant Odom and other survivors of the Gambier Bay. The enemy survivors who witnessed these attacks from afar must have given 3 cheers, said Admiral Ugaki. How right he was. The sight of the planes harassing their enemies was the only happy aspect of the plight of the men of the Gambier Bay that day. Among those planes, their own commander Huxell had been unable to secure any bombs at Duag, so he did not get back in the fight that day. But Lieutenant Stewart had found gas and ammunition at Tacloban, and he organised the fighter component of the squadron and kept 4 planes in the air most of the rest of the day. In the next 3 days, they fought the Japanese in the air, and Stewart shot down 1 enemy fighter and assisted in the destruction of another that was attacking a ship. In Leyte Gulf, Enan Bennett's fighter was forced down at Enen. Bennett and Lieutenant McGraw had not followed Stewart to Taban. They had landed on the USS Manila Bay seeking gas and ammunition. At 11:15 a.m., they joined 5 Manila Bay fighters and 10 torpedo bombers in a search for Kurita's force. They passed over the Choai, dead in the water with her destroyer circling, and over the survivors of the Gambier Bay, and never saw them. They found the Japanese off Samar, heading almost due north away from the battle. Enan Bennett joined in the attack on a cruiser with his torpedo bomber loaded with bombs. He started his glide at 8,000 feet and joined in to avoid the heavy anti-aircraft fire. He dropped the bombs, and his crewmen reported 3 hits on the stern of the cruiser and 1 near miss. He returned to the carrier group and landed aboard the Manila Bay at 1:30 in the afternoon. McGraw joined that same force led by Commander Fowler, the squadron leader of Composite Squadron 5. McGraw dived on a battleship and strafed, and he saw Fowler's bombs hit the battleship amidships. McGraw then strafed a cruiser and a destroyer before he ran out of ammunition. On his way back to the Manila Bay, he passed over the Choai and saw a pilot in the water in his life raft, but completely missed the survivors of the Gambier Bay. McGraw landed aboard the Manila Bay at 2:15 p.m., was debriefed by the ship's air intelligence officer, and reported the downed pilot and his own adventures. He was back in the air at 3 o'clock, this time as section leader of an 8-plane flight on combat air patrol. The Japanese had begun their air support of the show plan that morning, and by mid-morning, many Japanese airplanes had begun to appear in the later area. This time, something new had been added. Admiral Onishi, the commander of the Philippine Defense, had decided that desperate means were all that were left to him and had organized the first of the kamikaze units. At 7:25 that morning, as the Gambier Bay was maneuvering desperately to avoid the Japanese battle force, the Shikishima unit of the new Kamikaze Corps took off at Mabalacat, looking for the enemy. The force consisted of 5 kamikaze self-termination divers, escorted by 4 Zero fighters whose pilots were on hand to remain above the attackers, protect them, and then return to base to report on their successes. As the Japanese planes neared, Admiral Kura's cruisers and battleships were scoring hits on several of the escort carriers. The Kennan Bay was hit repeatedly and could not land her planes. The Fanshawe Bay was hit by fire from 2 cruisers and several Japanese destroyers, and the Kitcon Bay was damaged by 1 near miss. When Lieutenant James Murphy of the Kinnin Bay needed to land to refuel, he found haven on the St. Lo, another of the carriers of Taffy 3. He landed at 10:40 a.m. 10 minutes later. The pilots of the Shikishima Kamikaze unit found the St. Lo, and Lieutenant Yukos Seki made history by diving onto the flight deck of the St. Lo in a Zero fighter armed with 2 bombs under the wings. In less than an hour, the St. Lo had been abandoned and sank. Earlier that morning, the Santee had been hit by a crash-diving plane, or one that fell on her. The Petrop Bay was damaged by a near miss. The Swanee was hit that day too, but was again taking planes aboard before the day was over. The White Plains was damaged by a near miss, and the Kitcon Bay and Kinnin Bay were both hit again by kamikaze. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, it was no wonder that McGraw was flying combat patrol instead of striking on the Japanese force. About an hour and 15 minutes out, McGraw and his flight spotted 18 Val bombers with an escort of a dozen Zero fighters. They attacked. McGraw shot down 1 fighter, and his wingman shot down another. He shot down 1 bomber, then he ran into a flight of 6 planes. When they turned out to be Zeros, he decided on discretion and went back to the carrier. That evening, a Japanese submarine attacked the force and very nearly sank the Petrop Bay, although she emerged safe. All this activity made it quite certain that Lieutenant Odom's prediction would be correct. As the sun began to drop in the sky above the survivors of Samar, they were wondering just how long it would be before the ships or planes came out to get them. The truth was that on this busy day, threatened by enormous force and an entirely new weapon, Carrier Division 26, Taffy 3, and Task Group 77.4 had no time to give to thoughts of rescue, and no one at Task Force 77 had apparently thought about it either. In a few hours, the Kurita Force and the kamikaze and submarines had inflicted more damage on the American naval forces than the Japanese had managed since the Formosa battle, which, after all, was part of the show plan. The plan would not succeed. It could not. But in the execution, the Americans were put to straining every resource to destroy their enemy and protect their ships. The men in the water would have to wait. The Gambier Bay had sunk at 11 degrees 3 north latitude, 126 degrees 12 east longitude, which was about 60 miles east of the island of Samar, and 90 miles north of San Pedro Bay in Leyte Gulf. On the island of Leyte, the general drift of the current was westward towards Samar. The sinking was observed by other ships of Taffy 3 and reported by Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of the unit, to Admiral Kincaid down in Leyte Gulf, with a request that rescue operations begin immediately. That message, however, was but one of scores transmitted in the morning hours of October 25th. Others told of the sinkings of the destroyers and the escort, the destruction of the St. Lo, and the attacks on the other carriers. So much information produced confusion. At noon, one passing airplane did see several hundred survivors in the water, and the pilot returned to report to Admiral Felix Stump aboard the Noma Bay. But as was not unusual for carrier pilots, his navigation was a little off, and he placed the survivors in position 30 miles south of their actual location due to an error in transmission. When the word was finally given to begin search at 3:30 in the afternoon, the error was compounded. The USS Richard S. Bull and the USS Everall were ordered by Admiral Thomas Sprague to search at another spot just as far away. They found nothing. Meanwhile, the men of the Gambier Bay and those of the Johnston hull, Samuel B. Roberts, along with the other survivors, waited hopefully for the rescue they were sure would come in a matter of hours. Aviation machinist's mate. Third-class Peniac was with a small group, and pharmacist's mate Horace Phillips was with them too. He had a shell casing strapped to his shoulder, carrying medical supplies, and swam from raft to raft, giving first aid to those who needed it. As night fell, the men wondered when they would be rescued and began to pray that it would be soon. After dark, the last Japanese destroyer parted from the Choai, and shortly afterward went down with a single underwater explosion. Peniac felt it as a blast of cold water against his hindquarters. The destroyer flashed its lights in Morse code and then moved away as the ship continued its northward journey. Peniac looked for his pistol and found it, the barrel dripping water. His life jacket, now a drag, was about to be discarded when he realized he could use it as a lifeline. He passed it through a loop of rope in the life raft and tied it around his waist to keep from floating away from the others. As night descended, he began to see things that were not there. Chief Montgomery had joined a group of men who were spreading a floating life net, a difficult job due to the lack of enough nets. Lieutenant Commander Houlihan was in charge, and Montgomery swam around the perimeter to try to spread the net. He saw a man in white, apparently a mess cook or baker, who was not helping. Montgomery nudged him only to discover the man was dead. He took the man's identification cards and gave them to Houlihan. Montgomery's group had a fine view of the aerial activity above. Each time a flight of planes came over, they cheered and pointed, shouting, "They went that-a-way." They were expecting rescue hourly. As darkness came, it was broken by the glow from the burning cruiser Choai, and then they saw the light go out and heard underwater explosions. It grew colder in the water, and they tied themselves together with the strings on their life jackets. One of the men, ship's cook Leonard Martin, had a large piece of shrapnel sticking out of his back. Someone attempted to pull it out, but one of the ship's surgeons stopped them, fearing that removing it might cause Martin to bleed to death. Montgomery and others took turns holding Martin's head above water and comforting him. During the night, the life net did not let anyone dry out. In the centre, a man resting on the net would be waist-deep in water, while at the edges it was shallower. The men were cold and constantly drenched with salt water. Most found themselves in groups where they knew at least a few of the others. Lieutenant Cooming found himself on the edge of a raft with a group of men he could never remember seeing before. The life of an officer in the Combat Information Centre was a restricted one. These were men from below decks. He clung to the lifeline, as did the other able-bodied men, while the injured and those out of their heads were kept on the raft. Chief Flanders counted 37 men in his group. They did not have a life preserver or a raft, but kept together, supporting themselves on a piece of a blown-up donut-type raft. The able-bodied supported the wounded, but as night fell, the badly wounded began to die. One man from N Division had his leg shot off at the knee. When he died, Chief Flanders took his life preserver, and the body was pushed away into the sea. Helmsman Dahlstrom was long in recovering from his sense of panic. He believed he saw sharks right under him as he swam away from the ship, and then felt alone for hours, with only his life belt to sustain him. As darkness fell, he saw a raft and shouted, "Is that you, Berger?" A voice aboard the raft answered, and it was his friend Floyd Green. They had been together since the commissioning of the ship. Green and others pulled Dahlstrom aboard the raft, and he felt he was saved. With Captain Vaag's group, which joined the Ballinger group just before dusk, 140 men were together. Around 750 men had escaped the ship by sea. 51 pilots and aircrew members had flown off the ship in the morning, and nearly 200 men had gone down with the ship, most of them killed by the Japanese shelling. In all groups, the wounded began to die, and in the Ballinger group, the wounded and the dead were dragging the rafts down. So in the evening, Ballinger ordered that the dead be cast adrift. It was done, and soon after, the sharks arrived. At first, some men said they felt fish brushing their legs, but there were no attacks. Captain Vagg ordered the rafts strung out in a column to slow the drift and increase the chances of discovery. He sent Ensign Zola into the lead raft to keep the men busy, trying to put an officer in every raft. Zola tried every means he knew to keep spirits up. He swam back to the captain's raft and asked how long they would have to keep this up. The captain encouraged him and sent him back. Zola was swimming slowly alongside the string toward the lead raft when he passed a raft occupied by a young enlisted man with a piece of canvas over his head. "Mr. Zola," said the man, "you'd better hurry." "Why is that?" demanded Zola. "Because there's a big shark behind you." Zola, very tired, sprang into immediate action. He thrashed his way onto a floater net and sat there shaking for 5 minutes. When the shark was gone, he went back to his number 1 raft to try to keep up morale. That night, the men had a meal consisting of 1 biscuit, about the size of a Ritz cracker, with a piece of Spam. Seaman Heinel ate and vomited. The absence of fresh water was beginning to take its toll. Some of the wounded and some who were not wounded simply drifted away and were not seen again. 1 man drifted off but was brought back by the blowing of a whistle to attract him. At dawn, hope returned. Surely they would be rescued. They looked around the horizon, but there was nothing. The night before, as they dozed in their nets and on their rafts, destroyer escorts Bull and Everall reached the false position and combed it for 4 hours. Then they had a new report and went off in another wrong direction. For some reason, the entire command of the 7th Fleet had fouled up the search. Perhaps Admiral Thomas Sprague was too concerned with the state of his other carriers to worry about the problem. Perhaps Admiral Kincaid was too preoccupied with the kamikaze attacks and his anger at Admiral Holly for leaving San Bernardino Strait uncovered and not informing him. The fact was that the 7th Fleet had a perfectly adequate air search system, but it was not put into effect. No aircraft was sent out on the first day to find the survivors and direct ships to them. The first serious attempt to find the men was ordered by Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbe, who had no basic responsibility for the men of the Gambier Bay. He formed Task Group 78.2, consisting of 2 patrol craft, Patrol Craft 623 and Patrol Craft 1119, and 5 landing craft infantry gunboats under Lieutenant Commander J.A. Baxter. He sent Surgeon Lieutenant D.B. Lucas from his flagship, the Blue Ridge, and 2 pharmacists' mates, but they had orders on such short notice that they had to fuel before leaving on the search. They did not get underway from San Pedro Bay until 6:30 p.m. on October 25th, and could make only 10 knots, meaning nearly 10 hours to reach the point 90 miles north where the ship was supposed to have gone down. Lieutenant Budus, one of the Combat Information Center officers who had escaped just before the ship went down, was injured and bleeding from several wounds. He was told to stay on a raft, but as morning came, Budus felt he should take his turn in the water and came down. Captain Vagg and Commander Ballinger ordered the rations opened again, and that morning the men had a malted milk tablet and another bite of biscuit. Some could not swallow because their throats were so dry. Budus was in the water when he got his rations and ate them. As Hammond looked down, he saw his white skivvy shorts. Lieutenant Budus suddenly let out a yell, "A big fish!" and then began screaming. The men in the raft grabbed him and pulled him in, but Budus was severely injured. His entire buttock had been ripped off, and he had bad bites on his back and legs. He was half unconscious, and the damage was too severe for any remedy. Budus lingered for a few hours before he died. Hammond saw the huge shark that had attacked Budus lurking under the raft, and soon sharks began to appear all around the rafts. The men beat the water with hands and paddles to drive them away, but not far enough. One man was badly bitten on the left hand while trying to fend off a shark. That morning a prayer was said for Lieutenant Budus, and he was consigned to the sea. Chaplain Carlson led several prayers, and most joined in wholeheartedly. On the second day, thirst became a major problem. On Hammond's raft, a radio man decided to drink seawater, believing all he had heard about it was untrue. At first he found it delicious, but within an hour he began to suffer and became delirious. Seaman Heinel also drank seawater, but seemed to suffer fewer ill effects. On Deo's raft, some men decided to drink seawater, leading to fights. 2 men said they were going to get beer and dove into the sea, never to reappear. Another 2 men said they would swim to an island they could see clearly a few miles away, and they too disappeared. O.A. Loranda must have swallowed a lot of seawater, for on the 2nd day he became delirious and had to be taken into the life net and watched. In Montgomery's group, he and several other petty officers tried to prevent men from drinking seawater. Ship's cook Martin became delirious from his wounds and died that 2nd day. Montgomery held Martin as he died, and shortly after had to swim around the raft to restrain men trying to drink seawater. The men's mental state deteriorated. Montgomery saw mirages of cool mountains and a fleet of rescue ships that did not exist. At one point, a man began pounding on Montgomery's head, berating him for sneaking in ahead of him in the chow line. Toward midday, Montgomery spotted something on the horizon and swam out to investigate. He and another man found Chief Storekeeper Mardle towing 2 wounded men supported by life jackets, Forrest Court and Hillard Denard from Composite Squadron 10. Mardle had a water breaker full of fresh water. They brought the wounded men in and rigged a drinking hose from one of the May West inflation hoses to a spigot on the breaker. The wounded were served first, but every man received a small drink of water and a malted milk tablet for lunch. On the 1st day, the weather had been favourable. Clouds kept the sun away, and several times it rained, allowing the men to get some water. But on the 2nd day, the sun was bright, clear and hot, causing nearly all the men to suffer from sunburn. In Montgomery's group, they found a drum of oil floating nearby and smeared it on their faces, but it was too late. They were already badly burned. That day, Montgomery's life jacket began to give out. Warrant Officer Hughes had found a gangway post and offered half of it to Montgomery, who gratefully accepted. It meant locking one arm around the post for support and then switching arms every hour. Early on the morning of October 26th, Lieutenant Commander Waring and Seaman First Class O'Rill Propes decided to seek help. The captain and Commander Ballinger agreed to the mission, but had little confidence that they would reach Samar. They took a 1-man life raft and set out. They soon came upon another life raft with a dead man in it, which they hitched to theirs, believing they could identify the man upon reaching shore. By afternoon, the trailing raft was half sunk, and sharks were attacking the dead body. Realizing they were carrying shark bait, they cut the other raft loose. The sharks surrounded their raft, but they slashed at them with paddles until the sharks eventually swam away. Back with Captain Vagg's group, Ensign Zola developed a laughing jag. He swam to the head of the rafts, tied a rope around his chest, and began chanting, "Heave ho! Heave ho!" making the men believe they were moving closer to land. On the 2nd day, they could see the mountains of Samar, which was no mirage, but they were still many miles from safety, and the current was taking them slowly. They saw planes overhead, and Captain Vagg fired a red flare, but in bright sunlight it was unlikely to attract attention, and the planes flew by without responding. Aviation machinists mate. 3rd Class Peniak's group also saw the planes and later a PBY Catalina flying boat. They flashed mirrors and fired a flare, but received no response. Early on October 26th, Admiral Barbay's rescue ships reached the reported point where survivors were seen by planes the day before. It was actually 30 miles south of the Gambier Bay's sinking site. They combed the area but found nothing. The Bull and Everall continued to search until evening, unaware of Barbay's rescue force. They were eventually recalled to strengthen the destroyer screen. Lieutenant Commander Sargent suggested moving further north by noon on October 26th. The rescue group reached a point 18 miles northeast of the Gambier Bay's sinking site and began working south and west. At 3 p.m. they spotted a survivor and hurried to pick him up, only to find he was a Japanese pilot who knew nothing about the Gambier Bay. They took him aboard, and around noon, ODM's group made contact with the Beres group. Several groups drifted close together as they were carried towards Samar. It became clear they would reach the island, but with Japanese forces still in control, The prospect of being taken prisoner seemed preferable to drowning or death from thirst. By the afternoon of October 26th, faith in Admiral Kinkaid's rescue efforts waned, and there was more talk about the prospects of landing that night. ODM and Chief Polanski decided to swim over to join B's group. They wanted to confirm the prospects as the smell of land was in their nostrils. Odom bumped into a large fish, but he never discovered what it was, perhaps a dolphin or a shark. When he reached the group, Odom informed Boris that his men had no water and little food, and they were in desperate condition. Boris acknowledged that everyone was in a similar situation, but said he had nothing to offer. Odom then indicated that he would return to his own group if Boris couldn't provide any assistance. Boris told him to rest on the raft, but Odom's dramatic announcement did not have the desired effect. Ronnie, a fellow survivor, told Odom to rest, but the night brought further terrors. Lieutenant Bell, who had apparently drunk seawater, began hallucinating and decided to swim to Samar. Each time he tried, someone brought him back, but on his third attempt he managed to slip away unnoticed and did not return. Most of the survivors, except for a few, had given up hope of rescue. Chaplain Carlson had removed the silver crosses from his shirt, anticipating capture by the Japanese, who he had heard always killed chaplains first. Commander Boris, however, did not share the general feeling of resignation. He was busy with his flares and very gun, believing they would be rescued. Every hour he sent up a flare. At 10:30 that night, one of his flares was spotted by Admiral Barbet's rescue group, which had reached a point 20 miles east of the survivors. The patrol craft 623 was detached and sent ahead to investigate the flares. The patrol craft approached cautiously, fearing it might be a Japanese trap. At around 1 a.m. on October 27th, the patrol craft 623 arrived at the rafts. The crew of the patrol craft, with their searchlight probing the rafts, asked if they were American. The survivors' response was a loud and clear, "Yes, yes, we're Americans, Gambier Bay." The patrol craft slowed, and sailors began lowering nets for the men to climb. Lieutenant Odom, one of the first to start swimming toward the boat, was nearly drowned by the rush of fellow survivors climbing over him. Once he was freed and made his way up the netting, he sprawled face down on the cold steel of the deck, weeping and thanking God for his deliverance. This was an emotion shared by all the survivors of the Gambier Bay. Admiral Barbet's rescue team spent the next 10 hours picking up survivors. Some, like Odom, were nearly drowned in the rush. Lieutenant Patterson and a chief, who had been hanging onto the lines of a small raft filled with wounded men, finally made it to the patrol boat after a 2-hour wait. The rescued men were treated like royalty, receiving water, food, and sleep. The wounded were treated by medics and doctors, and some amputations were performed aboard the ship. Lieutenant Odom discovered that his lower body was paralyzed as he climbed the netting, but the sensation wore off after a few hours. O.A. Loranda had not regained consciousness during the ordeal and came to aboard the rescue ship, being fed water from a teaspoon. Lieutenant Piskey nearly drowned when someone stepped on his head while climbing the net, but was helped aboard by a sailor. He fell flat on his face, but later woke up in a bunk bed 12 hours later. By late on October 27th, Commander Baxter decided that all survivors in the area had been rescued and set a course for San Pedro Bay. The squadron had 1,150 survivors aboard the half-dozen ships, but Baxter was mistaken. Several groups of Gambier Bay survivors had not been rescued, including Seaman Deo's group, which was eventually rescued by a PT boat after 72 hours in the water. Admiral Barbet's rescue group reached port after several adventures. A Japanese aircraft had swooped down on the formation, but upon seeing the crowded decks of survivors, the pilot refrained from attacking. 2 more Japanese planes flew over later, but they too flew away. Commander Baxter requested air coverage, but no planes appeared. After regaining their strength, Captain Vagg and Commander Ballinger began assessing the casualties. It would take days to complete this task. Commander Ballinger estimated 23 known dead and 100 missing. Of the 950 men who had remained on the ship after the squadron's planes had flown off, fewer than 800 had abandoned ship, and only about 700 were rescued, with nearly 150 injured or wounded, some of whom later died from their wounds. At midnight on October 27th, the flotilla approached San Pedro Bay, and shortly after 1 a.m. they entered the bay. The survivors were taken aboard hospital ships or transports for movement toward the United States. Lieutenant Odom was sent aboard a landing ship tank with 115 men for transfer to Hollandia. The survivors of the Gambier Bay were eventually transferred to a ship bound for the United States. Their voyage was relatively pleasant until they encountered a typhoon, which added a new challenge to their ordeal. During the journey, Lieutenant Odom occupied his time taking statements from survivors to help Captain Vegg write an accurate action report. Upon reaching Hollandia, they found the large liner Lurline in the harbour, rerouted there by direct orders from General MacArthur. Most survivors boarded the Lurline, which sailed for Brisbane, where they spent 2 days before heading to San Francisco. News of the battle quickly reached America, and the story of the Gambier Bay was front-page news nationwide. The survivors were soon interviewed, and their tales filled the press. Louise Bassett, living with her parents in Madison, Florida, was pregnant and under the care of a doctor in Thomasville, Georgia. She had heard fragmentary news about a massive sea battle near the Philippines, and later learned that the Gambier Bay had been sunk. Initially, she received a strange letter stating only that her husband was all right. However, Lieutenant Bassett, who had flown off the Gambier Bay, was unaware of the true fate of Flonnie Bell. When he returned home, he learned the full story and realized that there was no hope. Admiral Kurita, who had been involved in the battle, hesitated and then decided to retreat due to heavy air attacks and the destruction of other Japanese forces. He eventually headed back to Brunei Bay, losing most of his fleet to American planes along the way. By October 29th, the last major naval battle of World War II was over. The ships that had sunk the Gambier Bay and threatened the Leyte landing operation were no longer a threat. Admiral Kurita's fleet, though intended to remain a threat, was largely ignored by the Americans. The airmen of Composite Squadron 10 began making their way home. Lieutenant Stewart travelled from Marcus Island to Pearl Harbor and eventually to San Francisco aboard the Bellawood, which had been damaged by a kamikaze attack. Fred Dipio, whose group had become separated, spent months in hospitals and did not encounter other Gambier Bay survivors until his discharge in November 1945. When the Lurline reached San Francisco, the enlisted men were taken to Treasure Island and held in a fenced security area. Chief Montgomery saw a newspaper picture of sailors on leave in San Francisco and laughed bitterly, seeing himself and his comrades as the real survivors. Eventually, the chiefs and officers were taken to San Francisco, where they were re-outfitted and given leave. The men of Composite Squadron 10 and the Gambier Bay eventually parted ways, with different treatment and reassignments. Most enlisted men were given survivors' leave and returned home. Commander Hubel set up Composite Squadron 10 headquarters at the St. Francis Drake Hotel, and pilots enjoyed some downtime in San Francisco before being reorganized. On December 7, 1944, Composite Squadron 10 was reformed, and the pilots were given 30-day leaves before reporting to training in Oxnard, California, for a new carrier assignment. The men of the Gambier Bay faced the end of their ship's existence and were scattered to new assignments. Captain Goodwin and Captain Vegg continued their careers, and other professionals moved on, with some reservists continuing in the Navy and achieving distinguished careers. Lieutenant McClendon rose to flag command in naval aviation. After the war, many of the men returned to civilian life, but occasionally gathered to share their unique experiences. They reminisced about their time aboard the Gambier Bay and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, finding nostalgia and inspiration in their shared experiences. The small carriers, often overshadowed by the larger fleet carriers, had performed invaluable services, and the memory of their contributions lived on.